On March 14, 2016, a 62-year-old dairy farmer named Robert Henshaw made a decision that seemed practical, respectful, and financially sound. He was standing in his barn in Wadena, Minnesota, looking at a pristine John Deere 300CX front-end loader that had belonged to his father. The loader sat detached, carefully stored, still wearing the green paint his father had touched, brushed every spring. Robert had just purchased a new Kubota L3901 tractor. The dealer had quoted him $3,800 for the factory LA 525 loader. Robert looked at his father's loader. He looked at the Kubota. He made a choice that honored memory and avoided waste. It took him 11 years to understand what that choice actually cost. Robert wasn't reckless. He had farmed for 41 years. He understood hydraulics, load capacity, and metal fatigue. But what he didn't fully understand, what nobody explains when you're standing in a barn trying to honor your father's tools, is that compatibility isn't just about whether two things can be forced to work together. It's about whether they should be. The John Deere loader fit the Kubota tractor the way a size 10 boot fits a size 9 foot. It worked, but it never stopped fighting. If you value stories about long-term consequences, about the small equipment decisions that quietly shape decades of work, consider subscribing. These aren't dramatic tales. They're the ones that unfold slowly, over years, in ways that only become clear when you look back and realize the moment everything changed was so ordinary you almost didn't notice it. This is a channel for people who understand that the most important decisions rarely announce themselves. Robert Henshaw grew up on the same land he farmed as an adult. His father, Eugene, had run a small dairy operation, 32 head at its peak, until his death in 2015 at age 87. Eugene had been a John Deere man his entire life, not out of loyalty to the brand, but because the closest dealer had always been 12 miles south in Sebeka, and when you're running a small dairy, proximity to parts matters more than paint color. The John Deere 300CX loader had come with Eugene's 1987 4050 tractor, purchased new the year Robert's daughter was born. Eugene had maintained that loader with near-religious consistency, greased every fitting, painted every spring, replaced hoses before they cracked. When Eugene sold the 4050 in 2009, his knees finally admitting defeat on the clutch, he kept the loader. "Might need it someday," he'd said. He never did. It sat in the barn, covered with a tarp, visited only by barn cats and dust. When Eugene died, Robert inherited the equipment. By then, Robert had already transitioned away from dairy. The herd was gone. He'd kept 48 acres for hay production and custom baling work for neighbors. His old Kubota L2850, purchased used in 1996, had finally reached the end of its reasonable life. The engine still ran, but the transmission whined, the hydraulics wept fluid from a dozen aging seals, and the front axle had developed a wobble that no amount of adjustment could eliminate. Robert needed a replacement. His local Kubota dealer in Wadena had treated him well for 20 years. The Deere dealer in Sebeka had closed in 2012, consolidated into a regional operation 40 miles away. When Robert went tractor shopping, Kubota was the obvious choice. Not because of brand loyalty, Robert didn't think that way, but because the dealer was 9 miles from his farm, the service manager knew his name, and the parts department opened at 7 a.m. He ordered the L3901, 38 horsepower, hydrostatic transmission, reliable. The dealer, a man named Tom Vickery, who'd sold Robert the L2850 decades earlier, walked him through the options. "You'll want the LA55 loader," Tom said. "It's engineered for this chassis. Hydraulic flow, weight distribution, mounting points, it's all matched." Robert hesitated. "I've got my dad's old Deere loader, the 300CX, still perfect, never seen hard use." Tom didn't respond immediately. He was a careful man. He'd worked with farmers long enough to know that some conversations end relationships. "That's a fine loader," he finally said, "but it wasn't designed for this tractor." "I know," Robert said, "but I can make it work. The mounting points are close. I'll fabricate brackets." Tom nodded slowly. "You can make it work," he agreed. "But hydraulic flow rates are different between brands. Cylinder bore sizes, relief valve settings, cycle times. They're all calibrated to specific systems. You might get it on there, but it won't move the way a Kubota loader moves." Robert appreciated the honesty, but he also thought about the $3,800, and he thought about his father's hands on that loader, brushing green paint onto metal, keeping something alive long after most men would have scrapped it. "I'm going to try," Robert said. Tom wrote up the order. Tractor only, no loader. He didn't argue. He didn't warn again. He simply said, "If you change your mind, we stock the LA 525. Robert picked up the L3901 on April 2nd, 2016. It came in Kubota orange, clean and new, smelling of fresh paint and hydraulic fluid. He drove it home slowly, feeling the hydrostatic transmission respond to his foot, smooth and progressive, nothing like the notchy gear drive he'd lived with for 2 decades. The tractor felt lighter than his old L2850, more nimble, less punishing on his lower back. The next week, he began fabricating the adapter. Robert was a competent welder. Not exceptional, but competent. He'd spent 40 years repairing equipment, building gates, and modifying implements. He understood load paths, stress points, and the importance of clean welds. He measured the John Deere loader's mounting frame. He measured the Kubota's front subframe. The bolt patterns didn't match. The spacing was off by 2 inches. The angle of attack was different. He cut steel plate. He drilled holes. He welded mounts. It took him 4 days, working in the evenings after field work. He test-fitted the loader 6 times, adjusting and recutting until the frame sat flush against the Kubota's subframe. When he finally bolted everything together, it looked right. The loader sat at the correct angle. The hydraulic lines reached. The bucket curled and dumped smoothly. He connected the hydraulic couplers. The John Deere loader used a different quick connect standard than Kubota. Robert bought adapters from a hydraulic supply house in Brainerd. They fit. He started the tractor, engaged the hydraulics, and tested the loader. The bucket lifted, it curled, it dumped. Everything worked. What Robert didn't know, what he couldn't know just by watching the loader move, was that the Kubota's hydraulic pump delivered 8.7 gallons per minute at 2,350 psi. The John Deere 300CX had been designed for a system that delivered 11.2 gallons per minute at 2,500 psi. The difference wasn't catastrophic. It didn't cause immediate failure, but it meant the Kubota's pump had to work harder to move the same cylinders. The relief valve opened more frequently. The hydraulic fluid ran hotter, and because the cylinder bore sizes were larger than Kubota's factory loader, every lift cycle created slightly more force against the tractor's front axle than the engineers had calculated when they designed the chassis. Robert didn't notice any of this. The loader worked. He used it to move hay bales, load gravel, clean stalls, and stack firewood. It felt slightly slower than his old setup, but he attributed that to aging reflexes, not mismatched systems. The Kubota ran beautifully. The hydrostatic transmission was a revelation after years of clutching. His knees thanked him. His back thanked him. The tractor felt like the upgrade he'd needed. The first summer passed without incident. Robert baled hay, worked his fields, and occasionally helped neighbors with loader work. The John Deere 300CX performed exactly as it always had, smooth, strong, dependable. His father would have been proud. By the spring of 2017, Robert had logged about 240 hours on the Kubota. He performed the first major service himself: oil change, filters, grease points. The hydraulic fluid looked clean. The front axle showed no visible wear. Everything seemed fine. He didn't take it back to Tom Vickery's dealership. There was no need. In June, he noticed the hydraulic fluid temperature gauge climbing higher than usual during loader work. Not into the danger zone, but consistently 10 to 15 degrees warmer than when he was just mowing or pulling implements. He assumed it was normal. Hot summer days, heavy loads. He installed a small auxiliary hydraulic cooler, an aftermarket unit he found online for $140. The temperature stabilized. Problem solved. What he didn't realize was that the higher operating temperature was accelerating seal degradation throughout the hydraulic system. Not dramatically, not visibly, but consistently, month after month, heat was breaking down rubber compounds that had been engineered for cooler operating ranges. In the fall of 2018, Robert began noticing a slight sway in the front end when the loader was fully extended with a heavy load. It wasn't violent, just a small amount of lateral movement, a gentle rocking that happened when he drove across uneven ground with a full bucket. He checked the loader mounting bolts. They were tight. He checked the pivot pins, no excessive wear. He attributed the sway to the loader's age, to worn bushings in the 300CX itself. He ordered replacement bushings from a Deere parts supplier and installed them over a weekend. The sway improved slightly, but didn't disappear. The sway wasn't coming from the loader. It was coming from the Kubota's front axle housing, which was experiencing stress patterns the engineers had never anticipated. Every time Robert lifted a load, the oversized cylinders created torque that twisted the mounting points just slightly beyond their design tolerance. The movement was microscopic, invisible to the naked eye. But metal doesn't forget. It accumulates stress the way water accumulates behind a dam, silently, patiently, waiting. By 2020, Robert had put nearly 1,000 hours on the L3901. The tractor itself ran flawlessly. He'd had zero engine problems, zero transmission issues, zero electrical failures. It was exactly the reliable machine Tom Vickery had promised. But small things were starting to appear. A hydraulic hose developed a slow weep at a crimp fitting. Robert replaced it. A cylinder began losing pressure overnight. Not enough to affect operation, but enough that the bucket would sag slightly if left raised. Robert rebuilt the cylinder seal. These felt like normal maintenance issues, the kind of thing that happens to any machine after 4 years of use. In March of 2021, during an unusually heavy snow season, Robert was clearing his driveway with a full bucket of wet snow. The loader was fully extended, the bucket was raised to maximum height, and he was backing up to dump the load when he heard a sound. Not a bang, not a crack, just a dull, metallic click, like a bolt settling into place. He stopped immediately. He got off the tractor. He walked around it, looking for anything obvious. Nothing appeared broken. He lowered the bucket, raised it again, curled it, dumped it. Everything moved normally. He decided he'd imagined it. He hadn't. What Robert had heard was the beginning of a stress fracture in the front axle housing, right where the fabricated loader mount created a concentration of force that the Kubota engineers had never designed the casting to handle. The fracture was hairline thin, invisible. It would take 3 more years to become critical. In the summer of 2022, Robert's neighbor, a retired implement dealer named Carl Hendrickson, stopped by to borrow a post hole digger. He watched Robert load some gravel into a wagon. Afterward, while they were standing in the shade drinking water, Carl said, "That Deere loader sits a little different than a factory Kubota setup." "It's my dad's old loader," Robert explained. "Still runs perfect." Carl nodded. "Your front end rides lower on that side," he said, pointing to the left wheel. "You notice that?" Robert hadn't. He walked around and looked. Carl was right. The left tire sat maybe half an inch lower than the right. Robert checked the tire pressure. Both were at 30 psi, exactly where they should be. "Probably uneven ground," Robert said. Carl shrugged. "Probably." But it wasn't uneven ground. The axle housing was beginning to deform. The stress fracture had propagated far enough that the casting was no longer perfectly rigid. Under load, the left side compressed slightly more than the right. Not enough to cause handling problems. Not enough to notice while driving, but enough that a careful observer, standing still, could see the asymmetry. December 2023 arrived cold and early. Minnesota had already seen 2 significant snowfalls by Thanksgiving. Robert was busy with snow removal, his own property, 2 neighbors' driveways, and the parking lot at his church. The Kubota handled it well, but the loader work was constant. Lift, extend, dump. Lift, extend, dump. Hour after hour, day after day, the hydraulic system cycling through the same movements, the front axle absorbing the same loads, the stress fracture growing. On December 18th at 4:30 in the morning, Robert was clearing the church parking lot before early service. The temperature was 11 degrees. The snow was heavy and wet. He'd been working for 90 minutes. The loader was fully extended with a bucket of snow when he felt the tractor lurch. Not violently, but definitively, a sudden dropping sensation, like stepping off a curb you didn't see. The engine didn't stall. The hydraulics didn't fail. But the tractor was sitting wrong. He could feel it immediately. Robert lowered the bucket and shut off the engine. He got down from the seat. In the darkness, under the parking lot lights, he could see that the entire front end of the tractor was sitting at an angle. The left side had dropped nearly 3 inches. The right front tire was barely touching the ground. He called Carl Hendrickson, who arrived with a flashlight and a floor jack. Together, they raised the front end and looked underneath. The front axle housing had cracked. Not completely severed, but cracked wide enough that the casting had separated along a 6-inch line, right where Robert's fabricated mount concentrated the loader forces. The crack ran through the bolt holes, through the mounting surface, and into the main body of the casting. Metal fatigue, stress accumulation. 7 years of forces the axle was never designed to handle. "You need to get this to Tom Vickery," Carl said quietly. Robert had the tractor towed to a Dana on a flatbed. Tom Vickery came out to the service bay and looked at the damage without speaking. Finally, he said, "I can order a new front axle assembly, but it's going to be expensive." "How expensive?" Robert asked. "The part is around $4,200, labor and fluids, probably another $800. You're looking at $5,000, maybe a little more." Robert felt something cold settle in his chest. $5,000. More than the loader would have cost in 2016. Tom walked around the tractor slowly, looking at the custom mounts, the adapted hydraulic lines, the John Deere green against the Kubota orange. "This is good fabrication work," he said. "Clean welds, proper bolt grade. You did everything right from a construction standpoint." "But wrong from an engineering standpoint," Robert said. Tom nodded. "The loads weren't distributed the way Kubota designed. Every time you lifted something, you were putting force into parts of the casting that were never meant to carry that kind of stress. It's not your fault. You couldn't have known without engineering software and stress analysis. But that's why manufacturers design loader kits for specific tractors." Robert stood there in the service bay, looking at his father's loader still attached to the broken tractor. The 300CX was perfect. Not a scratch, not a worn bushing. Exactly as his father had left it. The tractor underneath it was destroyed. "Can it be fixed?" Robert asked. "The axle? Yes. We replace the housing, realign everything, pressure test the hydraulics, but you'll have the same problem if you keep using that loader. The new axle will just crack again, eventually." Robert already knew the answer to his next question. "What should I do?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Take the Deere loader off. Sell it to someone with a Deere tractor. Buy the LA525. Start over." The repair took 3 weeks. Parts delays, mostly. When Robert picked up the tractor in mid-January 2024, it had a new front axle assembly, a factory Kubota LA525 loader, and a total bill of $8,934. The John Deere 300CX was sold to a farmer near Akeley for $2,100. It went on to a Deere 545E, where it belonged. Robert heard later that it was still running perfectly. The financial math was brutal. If Robert had purchased the LA525 in 2016, the cost would have been $3,800. By trying to save that money and honor his father's equipment, he'd spent $8,934 on the repair, plus lost the $2,100 resale value differential. A factory Kubota loader would have held more value, and finally purchased the LA525 anyway as part of the repair package. Total cost of the decision, approximately $9,834 more than if he'd simply bought the correct loader in the first place. But the financial cost wasn't the part that bothered Robert the most. It was the time. 3 weeks without his primary tractor during winter. 2 neighbors he couldn't help with snow removal. 1 Sunday service at his church where the parking lot wasn't properly cleared. And the knowledge that for 7 years, every time he'd used that loader, he'd been slowly destroying the machine underneath it. Robert continued farming. The L3901 with its factory loader ran beautifully. The hydraulic temperatures stayed cool. The front end tracked straight. There was no sway, no weep, no settling. It moved exactly the way Tom Vickery had said it would back in 2016, matched, calibrated, engineered as a system. But sometimes late at night, Robert thought about his father, about the care Eugene had put into maintaining that 300CX loader, about the pride in keeping something perfect. Robert had wanted to honor that. He'd wanted to keep his father's tools alive, to put them to work rather than sell them off to strangers. The impulse had been respectful. The execution had been reasonable. The fabrication had been competent. But compatibility isn't just about whether parts can be forced together. It's about whether the forces they create can be sustained over time. A mismatched system doesn't fail immediately. It fails slowly, accumulating stress in places you can't see, until one cold morning, the damage becomes visible and the cost becomes real. Robert learned that honoring the past sometimes means letting it go, that keeping your father's tools isn't the same as using them correctly, that the most expensive decision isn't always the one that costs the most money up front. The John Deere 300CX lived on. Somewhere near Ackley, on a tractor it was designed for, it was probably still moving loads with the same smooth precision Eugene Henshaw had maintained for decades. Robert hoped so. He hoped his father's work was still valued, still useful, still perfect. Just not on his farm. Not anymore. The Kubota L3901 is still running. The factory LA525 loader has now logged over 800 hours without a single issue. Robert performs his services at Tom Vickery's dealership now. He doesn't cut corners. He doesn't improvise. He doesn't try to make incompatible things work just because they seem like they should. He thinks about that morning in 2016 often. Standing in the barn, looking at his father's loader, making a choice that felt obvious. He wonders if Tom Vickery knew, right then, exactly how it would end. He wonders if the dealer had seen this story before, with other farmers and other mismatched equipment. He wonders if the warning, "You can make it work, but it won't move the way a Kubota loader moves," was as clear as it could have been, or if there were words Tom didn't say, because some lessons can only be learned by living them. Robert doesn't blame his father. He doesn't blame the loader. He doesn't even blame himself, really. He blames the invisible nature of engineering limits, the way metal accumulates stress without announcing it, the way a decision can feel completely right for 7 years before revealing itself to have been wrong from the beginning. The John Deere 300CX was a perfect loader. It just wasn't a perfect loader for a Kubota L3901. And in equipment as in life, perfect in isolation means nothing if the system doesn't support it. Robert learned that at 4:30 in the morning, in a church parking lot, in 11-degree darkness, when he felt his tractor drop and realized that saving money and honoring memory are not the same thing as making the right choice. Some lessons cost $3,800 to avoid. Others cost nearly $10,000 to learn.